I'm waiting for Nikki to look up. I'd like to call to order the Committee of the Whole for Tuesday, March the 11th, 2014. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Calling the roll, Mr. Brady. Here. Mr. Germana. Here. Mr. Gallagher. Here. Mr. Schron is absent today. Ms. Conwell. Mr. Jones. Here. Mr. Hairston. Here. Ms. Simon. Here. Mr. Greenspan. Here. Mr. Miller. Here. And Ms. Conley.
Here.
There is a quorum.
I'd like to entertain a motion to excuse Mr. Schron.
I so move.
Second.
All right, moved by Mr. Miller and seconded by Mr. Germana. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed to have it, please mark Mr. Schron as excused. Is there any public comment related to the agenda?
No, Madam Chair, no one has signed in to speak.
Item 4, items referred to committee, presentation by representatives of URS. Bonnie, are you going to start?
Ma'am, would you like me to read it into the record before she begins?
Yes, that would be a good idea. Thank you.
Resolution number 2013-0170, a resolution making an award on requisition number 24534 to Halle Industrial Park in the amount of $10,069,265.64 for lease of space for the period anticipated to be June 1, 2014 through June 30, 2024. Authorizing the county executive to take all necessary actions and to execute all documents necessary to consummate the contemplated transactions, and authorizing the Director of Public Works to administer the project, and declaring the necessity that this resolution become immediately effective.
Thank you. Bonnie Tewan, Director of Public Works. The last time we met in regard to records management, consolidated storage, processing center, we had talked about, excuse me, the condition of the building and how we got to the recommendation of the Halle Warehouse. And even though we had talked about it before in our initial recommendations to you, we wanted to go over a detailed description on how we got to the selection, the recommendation of the Halle Warehouse. So I'd like to bring Mary Ann Lausch, she's our project manager on this project, to go over all of the steps that they went through to get to the short list, to go from the proposals that were received from us. I think we received 7 of them, to shortlist it to the 2, and the detailed analysis that went into the recommendation for the Halle Warehouse. So I'm going to hand it over to Mary Ann.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see you again.
Is that a Ukrainian pen?
No, it's not.
Okay.
But thanks for asking. So I wanted to review the process that we used to develop our recommendation with the selection committee. I'm going to talk about the timeline and the team, what part of the RFP that we reviewed, how we established the space program, and then what we evaluated for both the long list and the short list proposals.
Madam President,
Yes, Mr. Miller.
are you going to send us a copy of this presentation? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Although right now I'd like to see something besides some blank slides here. So. I apologize. I don't know if it's a flaw in the PDF, but I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to load up. That's better. All right, the timeline, just to refresh, the RFP was issued mid-July 2012. URS started our work at the end of August, and the RFPs were received mid-September. So the RFPs were on the street for 8 weeks. As soon as we got the RFPs, we began to review them. We toured all the sites about 10 days later in September. The long list review was October, and then the final short list review was in January. The project team from URS, I don't think I've ever introduced you to all the people that supported this effort. We had 5 architects that were involved in visiting the sites, assessing both the buildings and the contents, as well as reviewing the proposals and developing plans for that. We had 2 interior designer space planners that helped us with both the space program and the layouts. We had 3 engineers on our team, both mechanical and electrical, to help us. And we worked with a project and construction services known as PCS. They're an SBE sub of ours that helped us with the cost estimating. In the RFP, the county asked for approximately 2,000 square feet of storage space for this consolidated storage facility. There were 7 sections in the RFP. The sections that were most relevant to the assessment that URS did were section E and F. And specifically within those sections, in section E, we looked closely at the construction allowance, both the amount that the landlords offered, but more importantly, as we got into the short list, what the real cost of the tenant improvements were going to be. In section F, there was a request for quite a bit of information about the project. I think some of the things that were the most essential for this facility were the delivery access. There's a lot of material that comes and goes, and a large number of loading docks were needed. And of course, the building systems were very important, as well as the building volume, both the clear height and the floor loading capacity. By the end of the process, we looked at a number of different combinations of occupants for the building. We came up with these groups that includes 95 staffs. For many people that were first involved with this process, they assumed that this was merely storage, so just simply materials that were going to be managed in the building. But in fact, there are quite a number of work processes that go on here. The Board of Elections has both ballot support and election support here. They're constantly staging and moving their election materials, whether it's the ballot machines, whether it's the bags that's set up, whether it's the ballots themselves and the tabulation. But they have some very specific requirements for all their activities and their storage. Another group that's very important is the county archives. They have a lot of visitors and resources that come to them, as well as a very wide variety of materials that they're responsible for. And it was also decided to include the microfilming center of fiscal operations here, which is 34 staff members, and that group more than doubled in size during the course of this process. They have very explicit activities that they use to make copies of the county records and a lot of staging area. In addition, some of the more traditional kinds of store activities for both jobs and family services, children and family services, and of course the furniture storage, the print shop, and the warehouse administration were all part of this facility. In the space program, and I don't know how familiar you might be with it, but we go department by department. We list the types of functions and their requirements for that, as well as the square footage and the circulation factor. And we also look at building common spaces. So those, in this case, it was especially the loading dock, but also parking, security area was very important to that. And we met with all the staff departments in person, and in these cases, we would sit down and have an interview with them, but because their work processes were so important, we ended up having an interview as we walked around the building. They showed us how they worked, how their operations took place, what kind of spaces and furniture and equipment were part of that. We are also spent a lot of time understanding what their future situation would be. So it's not just whatever deficiencies or efficiencies that they have today, but how would they be working in the next 10 years, which was the future of this building. And then we would prepare our space program for them. This is an example of some of the things that we saw when we walked around the archives. We have a very detailed inventory of the size of the material, the quantities of the material, where they are in the building. The gray column are the comments that we got from Dr. Satina. So we prepared this and we asked for her review. She had a few comments on a few things. We were able to fine tune it. But this was what we used to begin to understand what kind of storage equipment they would need and the volume of materials that were not only stored currently, but what might be needed going forward. When we were looking at the program for stored materials, we visited all the locations, we photographed and inventoried the materials. The county at that time had a number of locations where they stored materials. Some of them have since closed, notably the Glenview Neighborhood Center and the Ameritrust Complex are no longer storing materials, nor is the Canal Street. And again, we developed a space program based on this. So this was an example of the inventory that was done for Glenville. We identified where the pallets of boxes were within the building, how many pallets in each location, and if they were full or partially full in order to determine that there were 3,060 boxes here on 133 pallets. And this is what the space program looks like. This is a summary of everything that is to go into this facility. And then this is an example of a detailed page for, this is one of 2 pages for the archives building, but you can see that we have, listed specifically that they need a work area for cataloging, that they have volunteers that come in so that we would provide workspace for the volunteers so that, because they're a very important part of their operation, well as a small greeting and reception area for visitors. So as we completed the space program, we had a basis of comparison in addition to the RFP to look at the proposals. In the RFP, people were invited to offer both new space to be constructed or existing space to be retrofitted for the county. All the proposals we received were for existing space. No one proposed new construction for us. In each of these cases, many of these are really shells, and with storage that's very typical that you get a building that's completely empty, there's not a thing in there, and it's up to the tenant to fit it out the way that you need. So there might be nothing at all. There may not be restrooms, there may not be offices, it might just be a big open space. And as I go through each of these sites, you'll get a better idea of the variety of spaces that we were offered and the conditions that they were in. We reviewed each of the proposals. We also walked through each property with one exception. We did the comparison to the program and the RFP, and then we summarized our findings for the long list meeting. This is the Warner and Swayze building. It's at 55th and Carnegie. We were not able to walk through this building. They were in the middle of an asbestos remediation, and the building was not accessible at all. One of the things I want you to notice on the floor plan, if you will, there are 2 loading docks here. There's one up here, if you can see the cursor, on this end, and there is another one that's sort of inside the building with a kind of a very awkward driveway coming in off Carnegie. So having 2 loading locations is good. There's 2 elevators, and those are what's shown in green, and it's unfortunate because one bank of elevators is totally away from the loading docks, and another set of loading docks is totally away from the elevators. So moving material through this building was going to be a challenge. These are some photographs that we took the day on site. You can see that the building will require significant restoration before it can be occupied. One of the upsides of that is that all the building systems that would be provided would be brand new. There's probably a higher cost to both the landlord and the tenant as a result of that. The second site is the Halle Warehouse. It's one that we've talked about before.
Could I just go, who owns the Warner and Swayze? Some Warner and Swayze, I mean, who owns it?
Geis.
Owns Warner and
Geis offered the building.
Okay.
In some cases, the landlord that proposed the building may have only had an option on it and
Okay.
Didn't own it. But in that case, Geis offered that property. So with the Halle Warehouse, this is a 6-floor building. 3 floors were already occupied by Cuyahoga County. The Board of Election is occupying 2 floors of it. One of the things they told us is they really like the location because it's only about 10 blocks from their headquarters, and so when they need to go back and forth, it's very convenient to them. This building has 7 loading docks, which is terrific, and 5 elevators in it, and 4 of them are freight elevators, and 1 of them is a passenger elevator. And so that makes it much easier to move materials through the building. One of the things that we notice when we walk through the building, you'll see in the lower right, it needs a new lobby that's more handicapped accessible and also has security. And so we have proposed that, and you'll see that later in the show. Within the building, there's also underground parking. The windows also were in poor condition in most cases, so the windows were identified as something that needed to be replaced. There's an emergency generator, there is an emergency generator on site, but on the left you're seeing one of the cooling units. And one of the things I will say about visiting the Board of Elections, I've probably been there about a half a dozen times. Every time we go there, it's laid out differently. They use their space very well. It's very flexible for them. And so whether they're charging voting machines or developing the ballots, they have found a way to continually reconfigure the space for their own uses. And it's fascinating to see, and it's kind of impressive too. This building is the other one that was shortlisted. This is the Shoreway Commerce Building. This building was formerly the White Motor Plant up near 73rd Street. It also has underground parking. It has lots of loading. One thing that was interesting about this site is it's 1 story only, so it doesn't have elevators, it doesn't need elevators. Even though this is part of a much larger project, it was possible for the county space to have its own entry and be self-contained. On the left, you can see the existing condition. When we walk through there, this is totally shell space. It's basically a big empty structure. It would have to be completely renovated from top to bottom for the county. And on the right, they walked us through some spaces that had been renovated and had tenants in them, so that we got an idea of what that might be like. This space does not have a lot of windows, but it has a significant amount of skylights, which give it bright, even light. Another site that we were offered we're part of the Huntington building, 4 floors in the middle of the building. One of the things that was noted about this building is the building would be shared with other tenants. The elevators would be shared with other tenants, and the loading dock would be shared with other tenants. The Board of Elections has told us they have a strong preference to be in an exclusively county facility, so that on the certain days where they have voting activities going on, that they can receive priority as far as the docks and the elevators. And in a situation like this, that might not be possible. The other thing to note about this building is these are the lowest ceilings of any space we saw. It has the most columns of any space. It's also the most finished. You can see it has a finished ceiling and carpets in space, and it has the lowest loading capacity of the buildings that we toured. This is the former Richmond Brothers property up at East 55th Street. I would say it's very vacant. It hasn't been inhabited for a long time. And the building itself is in poor condition. It's very large. The county would only take a portion of the building. It has had loading docks that are directly on the street, actually very similar to the way the Halle Warehouse works. The upper floors are wide open. It's a shell that would need everything, including elevator cabs. They noted in their proposal they have shafts, but they have no cabs in place. And you can see that it has bright light during the daytime hours. We visited a site up at 189th in Euclid in an industrial park there. That was the one that was the farthest from the central business district. It's a pretty typical light industrial property. It's 1 level. It has adequate loading, and it's very wide open, very few columns inside. It's another look at it. Of all the properties that we looked at, it had the least power capacity for this and no fiber available. And on the bottom, you see on the left some of the restrooms and some of the office space that had been fitted out for a previous tenant. And finally, this is the Goodrich property at 8,000 Kruger. It's a secure industrial site. These are the only pictures we have. They were in their brochure. It's slightly too large for the county, so there might be a secondary tenant in there. The loading was good. It has the highest ceiling height of any of the parcels that we looked at. It also has a lower level, and there's no fiber available on this site at this time. And this is really, a heavy industrial setting, very different than the other ones that we saw. So that gives you kind of a quick snapshot of the properties that were offered to the county. We took all this material to the selection committee, and in the process, the Halle Warehouse and the Shoreway Commerce Park were identified as the two shortlisted properties. So the next steps for us was to walk through these two buildings again. We received the drawings from the landlords. We wanted to compare the drawings to the conditions to make sure that everything that was in place had actually been included in the drawings. We also wanted to make sure that it looked like the dimensions were accurate because the drawings were going to be very important to us going forward. We test fit the space program. So what that means is we took all the requirements in the program and we did a preliminary design. We're not saying it's the final design. We're not saying that, everything is perfectly adjusted, but that it gives us a lot of information about how well the county would fit. It also gives us some, I think, directions of how we would improve it if it was the selected property. We developed a set of specifications for that work. So for each building, we identified window repair, the amounts of carpet they would need, what kind of lighting, what kind of heating systems, and we had that information for our cost estimators. One thing that's different between storage and office, in the industry, the real estate industry around office buildings, there's a very clear delineation about what's the landlord responsibility and what's the tenant responsibility, and those are well-defined standards that are used very consistently throughout the U.S. With storage, there are not those kind of standards, so just to be on the safe side, we identified and priced everything. So every kind of improvement that needed to be made to the building, we identified and priced it. Then what we did is we met with the landlords. We just reviewed the line items and the quantities with them, but not the prices. So we met with each landlord for typically about 2 hours. And we discussed the improvements we were recommending. We had some good conversations with them around that. In some cases, they told us some things about their building, recommended maybe a different strategy or a different material. In other cases, they thought that was a good idea. So we talked about the improvements, and then we talked about the quantities, and finally we talked about who was going to pay for what. And one of the things that was really valuable about this process, in both cases, the landlords increased the amount of investment that they were going to make in the building, and reduce the amount of improvements that the county would be making. And then based on those conversations, we went back and refined our cost estimates to get a good understanding of what the tenant improvement costs would be for the county in each case. So this is the test fit that we prepared for Shoreway. So the colored parts are the parts that the county would occupy. The white parts are the parts that would have other tenants in them. And most of that was already rented out. So the county would be kind of filling it up. Along the top of the screen, there is parking above there, and the blue is the archives, and right next to it you see a little gray section. Anybody from the public side that was coming to the building would park in front and walk in, and they have the ability to come down that little gray hallway and go into the archives to meet someone from Children and Family Services, to go to Board of Elections. There would be security set up there, so everyone coming into the building would go through security. Also along the very top edge, is where the county was going to store records and furniture, and there are loading doors and docks directly there. So it's very easy to open that space if they wish. Over here on this left area that's kind of tucked underneath was the main dock for the building, and that's where everything could come in. It could go into scanning, it could go into the Board of Elections, it could go to any place it needed to go. And in addition, as you move down into the orange space, there's more docks so that if the Board of Elections at election time, they could open up additional docks to move their materials in. So this is the entire group on one floor of this building. So one of the things we mentioned is that we felt the Halle Warehouse needed a new entry and a secure entry. So it was proposed to move the entry around the side of the building to Perkins. And so at the far right edge of the screen, that is the corner sidewalk in front of the building. And you could have a choice of coming up to this glassed-in vestibule. You could come up the steps, or you could take a ramp to enter the building at this location. That allows us to provide handicapped access to the building in a different way. Right now, it's awkward to get in the building, and where you first step in is about 3 feet below the main level. There's a lift chair for wheelchairs. Everyone else has to climb a little flight of stairs. Here's kind of a bird's eye perspective of that space. Again, starting at this lower corner down here, you go up the steps, you come into this vestibule, you see just the outline of the security belt and station on the floor, and then you would come around here to the existing elevator and the existing stairs. And this little room here is where the security staff would have their office spaces. This is the first floor of the Halle Warehouse. And down on the center, this gray zone is both the loading docks and the access to the parking below. One of the things that we eventually did is over here on this far right, this orange group is an area that's held by National Concessions. It includes 3 more loading docks and a little bit of space behind. So it was developed that space could be used for a Board of Elections. So as they get things ready to go out to the polls, they could stage them in there, get everything just all set and ready to go on the trucks. And they would have kind of this off to the side staging area, because they are continuing through the weeks leading up to the elections, packaging, organizing, putting things on racks, and getting ready to go out. So that would free up their floor space. This is all dock area. There's 1, 2, 3 docks here, and then 1, 2, 3 more docks over there. And then in the back would be the office for the warehouse manager, so that he's on the dock, he sees what's going on, he can help manage that and make sure that security is under control. The public entrance we talked about before, it's over here on this corner of the street. The other orange area is the Board of Elections. That's predominantly election support materials, so it's flags, bags, boxes, forms, all kinds of things like that. And then in addition to that, they have a workspace there, and they also have some of the voting machines there that are plugged in. This area up here is a little annex or addition. It's a 1-story space. It's a really good fit for the county print shop. If you look at this photograph over here on the far right, the door is open, so that's right where the trucks could pull in and drop off supplies and pick up their printing. A lot of the printing that they do is for the Board of Elections, so they're right next door, and that's very convenient. The lower photograph is the red bags and the blue bags loaded up on their carts, ready to go to the polls. The second floor would be exclusively Board of Election. I wanted to point out the elevators to you. So this big white space in the middle is a very large freight elevator. And then across the back of the building, if you see these boxes with squares in them, there's 3 of them, sort of on the left, the middle, and the right. So those are all freight elevators that would help them move materials between floors. And then in the front, there is the passenger elevator, and every floor would be secured. So as people came through the building They either have an appointment or the guards let people know that they're coming up and they're buzzed in. There's some workplace for the staff on this level. On this level is a combination of mostly voting machine storage and then their ballot support department. On the far left is an expanded area where they have lock storage for a lot of sensitive materials. The middle section, they might do tabulation there. They might do ballot review and editing. The ballots are bilingual, so they have teams that sit side by side and review all the ballots to make sure that they've been properly developed before they go to final printing. And so these are on the upper right. There are some of the voting machines look like big black garbage cans, and they pack them in very tightly, but they also have to be plugged in. They get a little trickle of electricity to keep them operating properly, and then here's a volunteer that's working on some of the ballots. The third floor is predominantly for storage for the Department of Children and Family Service. They have a handful of staff that manage their records here. What we found that this department has not gone very much towards electronic records. They really have a lot of paper. Their transition to electronic records has been slow. Both Children Family Services and Jobs and Family Services prefer to store their records in coated vanilla folders on the shelf. So on the upper right, you see this long line of just shelves with file folders on it. And for the life of the recipient, those folders are active and those are kept there. On the bottom is probably not a very good picture of some of the equipment. So these are carts that they use to move the voting machines, the ones that fold up like little blue suitcases. And when the machines are stored, they're all stored in a very compact way. And then the carts are stored somewhere else, and they're stacked up 3 high. And in front of them are some of the black bags that they use to move their equipment around. These are right now stored off-site with Mayflower movers. The idea was to bring them here to the Halle building where they would be a little bit more convenient. They're in a space that can be accessed by 2 of the freight elevators to allow them to conveniently move them up and down as they need to. The 4th floor is a space right now that's used by Jobs and Family Services. They have paper records there. They are not getting any new records there. They have not gotten any new records there for a couple of years. They have a small staff, including some workforce training folk, that are constantly going through the records and determining which ones no longer need to be kept here. So in the time that we've been working here, we have seen the amount of files here steadily reducing. So we've allocated them about a half a floor for their operation, and the remainder of the floor would be available to Public Works, probably for boxes that are in the retention schedules that are being held for a few number of years until they can be destroyed. The 5th floor is the floor that we recommend for the archives, and we are very interested in creating a nice environment for them, a really efficient workplace for them. So if you start on the lower left corner, that's where the visitors and researchers will step off the elevator and come into a reception area. There's a series of conference rooms and research areas that are here along the left edge of the building, along with the break room and restrooms on that floor. The next group over here are different kind of workrooms for volunteers and resources, so if they need to set up a project, they can do that. All the furniture in these rooms is very flexible, so there are small tables on wheels so they can be grouped together or pulled apart depending what their project is. There's also a work area for the archive staff to, as materials come in, they want to review them or code them, or if they're doing research for someone, they can do that. The remainder of the space is available for storage. And one of the things I mentioned earlier is they have a lot of different kinds of things stored in a lot of different kinds of cabinets. So they have tiny card catalog cards, like small index cards that are in their own unique cabinets. They have microfiche that are a little bit bigger. They have bound historic volumes with fabric and leather covers that are there. They have drawings on linen, in addition to all kinds of books and documents. So what's very important for the archives is to identify the right kind of filing and storage for all these unique materials and to lay them out in an efficient way. The total square footage on this floor is larger than what they have today in their current facility, and it will be a lot more efficient because it's a large open space instead of a series of small rooms. The pictures on the right are some that we've collected that shows a student doing some research at a library table, some shelving of materials. We thought that it would be fun to put some city images, whether historic or current, on the ends of these, just to kind of dress it up and go with the image of the archives, as well as a workroom where people could be doing their research and preparing their material. At this point, there is a small unassigned area in the upper right that could be for expansion. One of the things that we really grappled with on this whole project is there are new retention policies, or each of the departments are in the process of adopting their retention policies to really understand what they have to keep and what they don't have to keep. We were told that in many cases, you have to have well, in every case you have to have the records in two forms, but the forms could be a microfiche and a scan. And so for the departments that are ready to do that and ready to retrieve those records electronically, and Jobs and Family Services was an example of that, the amount of paper that they are keeping is significantly less. For other departments that are still, on their journey of changing the way that they do records management, there's still a lot of paper. But our sense is that over time, the amount of paper stored in this building that is going to reduce. The amount coming in every year is going to be less. There are some permanent records that are going to be building. So there are certain things that the archives keeps that are permanent records that they will always have. Voter registration cards are permanent. So there's some part of the collection that is permanent, but there's a lot of other material that will be stored electronically more and more going forward, and there's a lot of material on short retention schedules that will be destroyed at the end of the schedule. So that, we worked with each department to try to understand that and what volumes of material they might have at the time when they would come in the building, and how their future progress would be. The top floor is two groups, the microfilm on the far left, and the office space is, again, towards the far left side of the building. They have a series of stations where they do different activities, but I think the most important one is they have access to two freight elevators right where the color changes from green to tan. And so there are two elevators where they can bring the boxes up. They bring them up, they stage them, they get them organized just the way that they want to, how they're going to process them. And then sometimes they're indexed, sometimes they're scanned, sometimes they're photographed, and so they move them through. And so it was very important for them to have this open staging area for that. The other half of the floor is available to Public Works. There is a lot of furniture storage that they would like to have room for, and this floor also features the former fur vault. And I don't know what they're going to do with that, but it is a room that's conditioned.
What did you say?
Fur vault, where Halle's kept the furs off season. So I'm not sure what they're going to do with it, but it's part of the building. The other thing I wanted to mention to you about the Halle Warehouse, the 3 floors that are occupied today have heating and cooling. The 3 floors that are not occupied by the county have no heating, no cooling, and until recently were full of boxes stored by Iron Mountain. So going forward, those floors would have to be fitted out with new systems. So, and finally, there is underground parking in this building with, kind of look at a couple different counts, but let's say 55 or so spaces, including a couple of handicap spaces. You see a little bit of orange. That's some areas where the Board of Elections could store some materials. They like to keep spare parts for some of their equipment, and they don't always use them very often. So that's that. And then this is a stacking diagram. So if you cut through the building and you look at each floor as a layer, you can see how it's organized. So the gray on the bottom is the parking, the gray on the first floor is the loading dock and the print shop, the Board of Elections is always orange, Children and Family Services red, the fourth floor, Jobs and Family Services and Public Works, the entire fifth floor for the archives, and the sixth floor for the scanning and Public Works. This is just a sample of the cost estimates, just to let you know what we did. The left page is a summary of the whole estimate in its detail, and the right page is a sample of one of the details pages. These were for Shoreway, and this was the electrical system, which was one of the high budget items on that project.
Let's be able to read that. You can read that? Okay.
Finally, this is a summary on the Halle Warehouse of what the landlord improvements were and what the tenant improvements were. So the landlord was going to provide new mechanical systems on the floors that formerly do not have any heating and cooling. They would update the mechanical systems on the floors that are currently occupied. New windows, there are a few windows that they've replaced, but new windows for the rest of the locations. Paint the stairwells, update the restrooms throughout the building. There's multiple restrooms on each floor. They would make sure that there was one ADA restroom on every floor. They would repaint the ceilings. They would repair water damage. The windows are single pane windows, so they weep, and there is damage where the weeping has come into the building. And there were a few cases where there were roof leaks, and so there's also some damage to be repaired. And then the roof, they've been kind of patching it along, but the roof needs some work before a new tenant can come in. The tenant improvements, what the county would be responsible is the new security entry and lobby, the lobby restroom, any signage, new signage you want to put on the building, new furniture for the offices, which is fairly small since many of the workers in this building are pretty much on their feet, so their workspaces they're not a place where they're spending a lot of time. New shelving for storage. In the RSI report, they looked very closely at the shelving systems in the archives, and they said that the cost of taking them apart, moving them, and putting them back together would exceed the cost of replacing them. We would also repaint the floors, and then we need to do tenant build-out on floors 3, 4, and 5, which are completely vacant. And so since the shortlist recommendation last January, there have been some program requirements. The print shop was added, the building manager was added, and then the staff at microfilming center doubled. So we had to accommodate additional number of staff. There's been a refinement of the warehouse management process. There is an on-site warehouse manager to be hired. RSI did a little more detail on the storage and filing assessments that was very helpful. And then the Shoreway property itself is no longer available. They've found a tenant for their building. So this is kind of our dream, I think, for this, is to take all this important material that the county is storing in many locations and in many conditions, from good to maybe not so good, but to look at that and to find a way to store it very efficiently and effectively, to develop a records management system that will serve you well, and to create a place that's very attractive for people to visit and work. So, any questions that I can answer?
How well?
Through the chair, to your last point, the old storage shelves at the archives building, you said wouldn't be cost effective to move or dismantle to the new site, but what is the plans to do with them since we are selling the archives building? Are we just gonna leave them there? We gotta dismantle them and move them anyway.
That kind of fits in with the rest of what are we doing with all of our old furniture once we vacate the buildings, when we move into our headquarters. Similar conversation. There's a couple of different options. We could hire a liquidator that would possibly pay us for those, and then they would resell them, or we would try to sell them ourselves, either through gov deals or some other mechanism. When we moved out of the administration building, we had a sale on the weekends that might be a possibility. So there's a couple of different options, but we would look at possibly selling them in some form or fashion.
But I'm just, you still have to dismantle them. Even if you liquidate them, is that gonna come on us? So,
That would be, by your example, if a liquidator would purchase them, they would be responsible for dismantling them.
okay. Because it just seems like since we have to dismantle them anyway, we should be able to use them if they're in good condition.
We can
Save
look,
money.
yeah, we can look at that if that's, if that's the direction to see if it's cheaper just to buy new, or if we have to dismantle them anyways, then, you're right, it's probably just better to move them.
And then going back to an earlier point, I believe it was on the first or second slide, where did the boxes go that were housed in the Glenville Neighborhood Service Center?
Those boxes have all been moved to the RTA facility on Harvard, or
Okay.
leasing space
And I
there.
think you did answer that before, just had forgot. And last question, when you had the initial 7 buildings, did you go ahead and determine the cost for the build-out of all the buildings before you got down to your 2?
No, we just did the build-out costs for the 2 that were shortlisted.
Any other questions? Mr. Greenspan?
Thank you. Marion, could you go back to the slide where you had the tenant improvements?
Sure.
So just so I understand the mechanicals, we're talking about HVAC. One of the concerns I've had all along, both with the archives component as well as the storage of ballots on the Board of Elections side as well, is a complete climate-controlled environment.
Right.
And is that addressed in this landlord improvement package?
Yes.
So
Yes.
There's a humidity control, HVAC.
Yes, and it's different. The archives, for example, has fully conditioned, air conditioned, heating, humidity control. Those materials are probably the most fragile that the county has. Some of the other floors that have different requirements because their materials are more durable. So the section of the floor that has furniture in it does not need the same level of control. So, but we did go floor by floor and department by department, and we also tried to match those requirements.
And the which floor was the archives? Was 5?
5.
So that would be the new system floor. The new windows. You said it wouldn't be a complete building redo.
No, well, there are, I would say 6 or 8 or 10 existing new windows. So those were replaced in the last couple years. Every other window would be replaced.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, I just wanted to put an asterisk on that. So there's a few windows that were already replaced previously.
Okay. And as far as repairing the water damage on the walls, the floors, and the roof repair, well, I'll ask the roof in a separate issue. How will that be? What's the time frame on doing that? Obviously, we've got some active operations going
Well,
on.
Ryan did a lot of work with the landlord around these issues. So there's some day-to-day issues have been repaired as they go. So if there's a leak identified or there's a problem that's identified, it's been repaired. I know that Public Works has been following this very closely and keeping up with Board of Elections, and I think that my understanding is they have a process that's very effective, and the communications are really good, and they're keeping up with that. But there are a number of projects that the landlord would do if this lease was going forward. So at that point, they would invest, in a significant amount of roof repair. They would go ahead with the new windows. Their current tenants right now, they didn't require it, and if they had future tenants that didn't require it, I think they would avoid the investment. So it's
So the damage to the water, the repair water damage, that second to bottom bullet point, that's not a complete refresh of repaint, patching of all the walls as if it was a new facility or a recently renovated.
well, I'm not sure about repainting the walls. I know they're repainting the ceiling. I'd have to get into the notes. And also it would have to be working with the Board of Elections on anything internal that they want. But much of the outside wall has some kind of condensation from the windows that would need to be attended to.
Right.
And when they replace the windows as well.
Right, and the roof repair, it's not a replacement, it's a repair? Do you know the status of the roof?
We do know the status of the roof. I'm sorry, I don't have those details with me. But my understanding is not a total replacement, but that it's an update to the roof. I'd be happy to check on that and get back to you. Yep.
So as of right now, they're repairing the roof, but they're proposing to replace the roof.
Thank you.
So it will be replacing the roof? Yes. The parking that was listed, right now, as I understand it, that's complete, BOE has complete control of those parking spaces, is that?
Well, the county would have control of the parking spaces. Right now, there is some improvements the landlord would need to do down there to make more spaces available. So they've built out, they almost look like sheds and small storage spaces, and also the Board of Elections has used some of the vacant spaces for storage of their materials. So there's more spaces that can be available in the future if the landlord takes out those sheds and the Board of Elections takes out their equipment.
So they're guaranteed, they would be guaranteed to keep what they have?
Yeah, I don't see why not.
I didn't see in there, I know that basement has had a history of flooding. And I would assume as a result of the history of flooding that there's some work that would need to be done to modernize or update that garage. I didn't see it on your list.
I know that there was a drainage problem last fall that was corrected. I don't know if there's any additional problems.
Okay, and you're not aware if there have been any since?
I'm not. No, I haven't been following that.
Okay. Because what I'm trying to, it looks like there's been some progress since the last time, or at least from what I recall from the last time we met, but there's still some items that if we're gonna enter into a contract still seem to be somewhat questionable. Do you have a copy of the latest proposed contract that we could review?
I don't have that. I would get that.
But, I mean, does it exist and we can get a copy of it? Okay, all right, yeah, if we can get that, that would be advantageous to understand what's in there. Because my concern is, look, my advocacy is for a brand-new state-of-the-art facility that we would own. So if that's not in the offering, and I don't know if it is or it isn't yet, but I at least want to put our folks in a facility that is as close to that as possible, that will not only last 10 years but beyond. That building does have a number of challenges, and I just want to make sure that we're addressing those. It seems to me there's still some questions.
So a couple of points, if I may. We'll get you a copy of the contract. If there's some issues that you have concern about, we can talk about them, and maybe we did address them with the landlord, and if we haven't, and we should, we can probably still do that. In regard to the build new, like we said in the beginning, that was part of our request, that any owner had the opportunity to submit a proposal for building new. We did not receive any, even though some of the buildings were just cores, and they pretty much, we would have had to been starting from scratch, but we did not receive any proposals for new construction.
Right. Well, just because we didn't doesn't mean we can't initiate the exploration if not presented to us. What are we on our contract now has expired, correct? And we're month to month?
With the Board of Elections, no.
With the facility itself, with, who's the group that owns it now that we're renting it, leasing it from?
It would be Greystone. We still have a current lease through the Board of Elections with them.
And when does that expire? No, I guess my point is we're still under lease
Yes.
agreement with them. All right.
Yes.
All right. I've been getting reports that they're not doing some maintenance as requested by the tenant. If we're under contract, I would like to encourage them to do so.
We touch base with the Board of Elections and find
All right.
out.
All right, thank you.
That's about question number 10, Mr.
Did I say, oh, we're on the, well, you didn't say the 3 limit rule, so I apologize.
All right, Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Brady.
Bonnie, from the first start, we were always talking about how exciting it would be to offer space to the cities. And maybe you have it in there, but I didn't see it. Where would that be? And say, best case scenario, meaning we're helping the cities out, say 40 cities come up with rooms 10 by 10. Where do we put them?
Our intention is once the Health and Human Services start consolidating, and as Mary Ann talked about, the one group, which is
Jobs and Family Services.
Jobs and Family Services, they have already started consolidate. That would be the space that we would offer to the communities. And our experience when we offer services to the community, not everybody jumps on all at one time. It's bit by bit. So I think that gives us an opportunity to, little by little, we have space available.
Mr. Brady?
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Well, I guess from my count, this has been in front of us for thorough discussion several times over the last year or so. I know I've shared some skepticism of some of my colleagues about it, and you know, one of the reasons that I was not completely satisfied was because there was sort of an impression given at a certain point that we were backed into this. These are my own words. Backed into this, and somehow commitments been made before this came before our body, and that we were just expected to okay it. Having said that, and having listened to your due diligence, get that right finally. I wanted to ask you if we were to go forward on this at some point in the near future, what your timeline would be for the building being ready for occupation.
So Mary Ann and I, do you want to talk about it? We talked about that yesterday, as a matter of fact, what the timeline would be. We're going to go with the assumption that today is the day that we decide that Halle Warehouse is the place to go, and we give URS the authorization to proceed. So completely design.
About 6 months to complete the construction drawings and get them ready for bidding. I would hope the landlord would start on their work very quickly. The bidding process with the
Usually
county.
about 2 or 3 months for the bidding process
And
from when
then
the plans are done.
Construction, conservatively 8 months, if you really push 6. So about 14, 15 months to move in.
All right, thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Anyone else have any other questions?
Through the chair, so you talked about 14 to 15 months. Would that include the breakdown of the archives and the other buildings? Would that all be consolidated in that 14 months?
You know, Adele, at the last conversation, Adele talked about the process of actually moving the archives, and because of the historic nature of all the material that's there, it's not something that you can do over a weekend, like you guys move to new buildings. So that would be done in phases over a period of time, still allowing the material to be referenced by the general public as best as possible.
But it would be simultaneous in that 14 months?
It would be after the 14 months, and then it would be over a period of time. It's
So it wouldn't even, that's a whole different process?
yes, in addition to the, did we say 14 months? Is that what it added up to?
So they would be, you know, say 14 months is move-in day. So before that, they would start preparing, and then, you know, maybe it takes them a month to get everything moved over. I don't know what their time frame would be.
You said 2 months.
We still have this item related to this about the records manager person, and as I understand it, you have posted for that position.
We do. We have the position posted. It's being posted for 2 weeks. I did actually send a link to that posting to Adele and her supervisor, that if she knows of any professional organizations, we're also going to search professional organizations to post that, to look for a process center manager. So we'll post it for 2 weeks. At that point, then we'll interview, and the approval process, it'll probably be 2 months conservatively by the time we get that person on board.
I mean, it's my feeling that I would rather have that person on board before we make our final decision.
And that's fine, and I appreciate that comment was made before, and, you know, we're trying to expedite the hiring of that person. Once they get on board, then they can review, you know, what we have laid out, if that's the direction that this group would like to go.
So then we'd leave this in committee pending that decision about of someone who would be in charge of the whole operation and be in a position to assess and further assess the all of the options here. Okay, so the recommendation is we leave this to committee, and you'll get back with us when we come up with that person. Thank you very much.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you, Mary Ann. All right, our next item is executive session, so we need to go into executive session regarding a labor management process. So let me find my sheet of paper here. All right, all meetings of the Cuyahoga County Council are open to the public under the Ohio Open Meetings Law. Under that law, council may go into executive session during a meeting for specifically authorized purposes. During executive session, council confers outside the hearing of the public. Council may not make any decisions about any matters in executive session. All decisions are made in public. This afternoon, the council will go into executive session to discuss a collective bargaining matter. During this time, our live stream will be down, and we will ask all those not specifically needed for the executive session to leave council chambers. Anyone may enter after the executive session is ended. Is there a motion to go into executive session for the purpose of dealing with a collective bargaining matter? So moved. Moved by somebody, Brady, seconded by Miller, and I'll call the roll.
Moving to executive session, Mr. Brady?
Yes.
Mr. Germana?
Yes.
Mr. Gallagher? Ms. Conwell?
Yes.
Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Mr. Hairston? Ms. Simon? Mr. Greenspan?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Brady, I said Mr. Brady, sorry, and Ms. Conley. Mo-
All right, we'll go into executive session, and all those not needed for this this collective bargaining matter, please leave. And our live stream will be off, and we'll be back in a few minutes. And we'll get Mr. Morales out the phone here. I told you never call me here, isn't that line from?